Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. Seems like we're in the season of league tables. A couple of days ago, there was a report, 2025 report on the world's happiness, which countries are the happiest in the world. And of course, it's always the same ones: Iceland, Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, and Finland, which is supposed to be the happiest country in the world. In my experience, it's a lovely country. I'm not struck by the Finns' happiness, but what do I know? The United States was ranked 24th, whatever that means, so not the happiest of country. Meanwhile, my old friend Parag Khanna has a new league table, very innovative, classic Khanna, the periodic table of states, in which he ranks the states for what he calls a post-Westphalian world. Parag is talking to us from Singapore, where he lives. Parag, before we get to your periodic table of states, I have to ask you, you're one of the most perceptive and insightful observers of international politics, peering at the world like our mutual friend Kishore Mahbubani from Singapore. What do you make of what's happening in America at the moment? Is it business as usual, or is something exceptional happening?
First of all, great to see you, Andrew. And can I make a comment on the happiness report, which I've been observing for the last couple of decades? Notice what they have in common. You could zoom into your map to just one sub-region of the planet to find all the top performers. So there's something skewed in the data there, obviously.
I wonder if it's the Finns and the Swedes, and of course the Danes are managing these reports to reflect themselves. It's probably the only way we can make them smile. I've never seen a Finn or a Swede smile.
I've just never been able to square Finland's happiness score with its suicide rate. You know, obviously you can see how the data, your sample has been reduced to only those who are alive, and therefore report their happiness.
Yeah, and I'm sure you and I have probably spoken at the same events in Finland. It's an astonishing place where during the day everyone's very dour, and then at night after a few drinks, they smile quite widely. So I'm guessing that this happiness report was carried out at night after 8 or 9 p.m. But
it would be classic Freakonomics, right? To say, well, if you had done this survey earlier.
Yeah, you've done it in the morning.
And this is a great segue. So one of the real methodological quibbles with the happiness report has been, obviously that it's survey based and perhaps has to be given the nature of the subject, but there's a huge distinction between happiness and satisfaction, right? So for example, in Singapore, they rank relatively low in happiness, relatively lower than the United States, even though I think it's the happiest country in Asia. But again, it's precisely because people who are ambitious are not necessarily satisfied that they may not rank high in so-called happiness. And unless these things are very clearly defined, not to mention that surveys like this are done in dozens of languages, you're going to come out with very subjective, kind of outcomes. So I and many, many others have never put a whole lot of stock in that report for just the few reasons I mentioned. But okay, so over to the big kahuna. Look, for those of us like you and me who, have been observing the evolution of the American political system, not just this moment in time, this snapshot, this anecdote, Trump 2 versus Trump 1, and so forth. Yes, there are worrying things, but here's the deeper point that's worth making, is that when you think about American politics as a complex system, you have to realize that, like any complex system, it's not simply going to snap back to what it was simply by virtue of what happens in the next election. And that's not only because, Trump is doing the things he's doing. It's because systems don't go back to what they were. So whoever is involved in the conversation around what happens in, 2028 or whatever the case may be, needs to understand that if there's one thing that's not to say that it's correct, but one thing to remember is that there were broken aspects of the system irrespective of who is president. And therefore, whoever fixes it, and by whatever means they supposedly fix it, whatever its future is, its future structure, its constitutional structure, the arrangement of institutions, and so forth, shouldn't actually look like what it was. That would actually be anti-evolutionary. So we should all agree that we want America to evolve institutionally in many other ways, but not to simply go back to some notion of some good old days, because that would not be in line with actually what we're trying to measure with this periodic table of states, which is a place that is resilient, right? Resilience isn't simply being or remaining what you were yesterday, right? Resilience is your capacity to absorb shocks and to be adaptive and to evolve with the times. And that's what we're trying to measure.
And you published this in Foreign Policy with some, as always with you, some wonderful graphics. So the subtitle of the piece, The Periodic Table of States, is the org chart for a post-Westphalian world. Not everyone, Parag, is familiar with what the Peace of Westphalia was and what exactly a Westphalian world was. So before we get to a post-Westphalian world, what is a Westphalian one?
Well, nice of you to share that Wikipedia entry so I don't have to rehash the entire 30 Years' War for your audience. But so read that to understand the Westfälische Friede, as it was known back then. Most importantly, and it is a misnomer, first of all, the notion that the Westphalian world really was universal, right? That we suddenly, in the year 1648 onwards, lived in a world of sovereign, equally legal states, is obviously a myth. In fact, the 17th century was the early phases of global, mid-phase of global colonial conquest and imperialism. So we've lived in a world of empires largely at the same time that we think of at least even Western Europe being divided nominally into mutually respecting, territorially distinct nation states based upon their own definition of religious order and so on. So we've lived in a world of empires all the way through till the collapse of the Soviet Union. And yet even today, we live in a imperial system. And as you know, I wrote my first book about this when we met 20-something years ago, about empires. The subtitle of the book was Empires and Influence the New Global Order. It was about American empire, European empire, and Chinese empire. So the notion of the Westphalian system being the universal, sovereign, equal states, the way we envision the United Nations is a Westphalian Congress, if you will, but it doesn't actually reflect underlying power dynamics. And as such, it is incapable of structuring those dynamics because it's more, driven by them than able to shape them. So there's that. So the other reason that they use this subtitle is because some of the charts and graphics that we have aren't really about nation states and countries, political units, polities as we know them. There's actually a whole series of things we've done right here, as you're showing, on non-state
organized criminals, militias. Yeah. It's funny, thinking out loud, Parag, some of the headlines for your new report, one from G0, Ian Bremmer's thing, suggests that why neither the US nor China is the world's strongest country. But the whole point isn't of the periodic table of states in a post-Westphalian world, is it's a post-state world. So it's a post-China versus the US world. Is that the point of some of this research?
So I think, of course, it's always headline grabbing to say US, China, who's up, who's down, who's number one, and there's more than a cottage industry around that.
Especially in Singapore, right?
Well, no, I mean, quite frankly, in America too, right? It's a very much a Thucydides trap kind of conversation around who gets to be number one. Again, I've always disputed the premise and the methodology because I believe that in an entropic world, a theme I've written a lot about, you have an inexorable diffusion of power. You will have multiple power centers in a multipolar global structure long into the future. Your lifetime, my lifetime, our children's lifetime. You will not have a number one. I've been very, very clear about that in all of my writings. So therefore, to be so reductionist, U.S. versus China is something I've always characterized as an oversimplification. Instead, what we're going after is this notion of stability, right? What makes a state stable? And how strong a state is by conventional metrics like the size of your army, size of your territory, size of your population, industrial capacity, natural resources, sovereign wealth, trade balance, currency reserves. All of those things matter, but they're not the only things that matter. States can be strong by those conventional metrics, but still not be stable, right? To complement that strength, you have to measure what we're calling the stateness, which is actually like the governance capacity, the state capacity, the ability to execute, to deliver public welfare, to have efficient institutions. And then we've brought in other criteria as well, like climate resilience, food security, energy security, things that actually matter more than whether you have 5 or 15 nuclear capable submarines, right? Nuclear submarines or nuclear weapons. So we really have tried to expand the aperture of how you measure the stability of a state. And the results speak for themselves because indeed neither the US nor China is number one.
Although the US, in yours, it gets a stability score of 20.65, which certainly puts it, in the top 10?
It's in the top decile, yes.
The top 3 are Switzerland, Germany, and Japan.
Right.
So you're a little bit more bullish than our friends who put the World Happiness Report together on the United States.
Well, I mean, these are definitely apples and oranges. There's almost nothing in common between the two indices. We're certainly targeting very different variables.
Or in the Finnish case, vodka and beer.
Right. So I could certainly add a vodka and beer index into the next iteration of this, if you like, if you consider that a feature of stability. But look, as I tell my German friends, we collected all this data late 2024. And of course, at the time, the only narrative about Germany was the country is falling apart, it's deindustrialized.
Yeah, but that's also, I mean, if the Germans are miserable, they're not German.
Right. But not only miserable in an emotive sense, but literally, the state is collapsing. But now, look, here we are a few months later, and we talk about Germany as the phoenix, right? And of course, there's a lot to be done. I was on a call with some folks in Berlin yesterday, and their internet went out, and I was just, tethering off my mobile, and I had a way better connection than them. We all know that there's, room for improvement there, but Germany's earned its place as number 2. And when the Germans say to me, wow, we rank number 2, how is that possible? I said, just think about how much worse it is everywhere else in the world. And that's a good way of answering the question. It's not that I'm, bullish or not about the countries that rank lower than Germany or Switzerland. This is a data-driven exercise. It's not just about the results, meaning, who ranked first and who ranked 15th. In fact, the gap between number 1 and number 15 is no more than 5% of the total scoring. So in other words, all of these countries are still stable, or you might say
it's like
stable.
One of our soccer games in Northern California, Parag. Everybody wins. However,
everybody wins. Everybody
gets a prize. I mean, you begin the piece suggesting that some of these rankings aren't particularly helpful. You talk about the worldwide governance, the World Bank thing, and then the VDEM for league table on democracies. Why? I mean, you must think your one matters, but a league table that comes up with Switzerland on top, Germany number 2, Japan number 3, the US in the top 10 isn't exactly news. So in other words, so what? What's the point of this table?
Oh, it's very new, because where else do you see big and small countries coexist at the top? You never do. When you're ranking power, you only ever see the US, China, Russia, India at the top. When you're measuring the quality of governance, especially democracy, you only see small countries from Northern Europe at the top. where have you ever seen a result where, when you're measuring the stability of a state, you have not only small and big, like Switzerland and America, you also have East and West, you have Japan and Korea at the top as well. And if you look slightly further down, you also have states that are not full democracies, which is, of course, one data set, one variable that often skews these outcomes. You actually have Singapore and China and, other countries.
So yeah, where does Singapore and China come? What number? I mean, I know that the US, if the US gets a stability score of 20.65, how do China and Singapore do?
In the sort of high teens, 20s.
And they're very different. I mean, they're kind of two ends of the spectrum. So
they're disadvantaged by the fact that we do bring in elements of procedural democracy, such as what the Worldwide Governance Indicators calls voice and accountability, rule of law, all of those kinds of things. So certain countries, we're not jettisoning democracy. It's just one variable among many, because I think, as you would agree, Andrew, to be a democracy does not mean that you are stable. Let's be clear. We are trying to measure the stability of the state because every country wants to be stable. No country says, yes, I would like another dose of instability, right? Not all countries say, I want to be more democratic, like Westminster, Britain or the United States. But every country wants to be more stable. So what we've done is to pull together a wide array of components. And those components range from the size of your army to the quality of your public institutions, to your climate resilience and your energy security, and say, if you were to do these things across this menu, this dashboard, you would be more stable. And so therefore, the outcomes really are different than a conventional set of rankings. So we're actually really pleased with this distributed outcome that we have here.
I bet you're gonna be welcomed in Switzerland, Parag. Are they going to give you some chocolate and a clock and a watch, a fancy watch? What does this tell us about, in all seriousness, about Swiss local democracy, Swiss economics, Swiss capitalism, Swiss relations or lack of relations with the outside world, and the fact that the Swiss aren't also, like the Germans, perhaps they're not the most cheerful of people.
Right. So again, we didn't build in the cheerfulness or the beer consumption per capita per year, where the Czechs rank very high, as you know. That kind
I can imagine.
So that's not one of our components here, but. The Swiss, yes. I mean, it's a mutual fan club for sure. I lived there for a couple of years. I did a book, as you know, a few years ago called Technocracy in America. And I praised the Swiss model and the Singaporean model as a kind of perfect.
Very similar in many ways, and very similar countries in lots of ways too.
In ways that people don't appreciate. So the Swiss, I didn't think they'd come out number one. I didn't think anyone would come out number one. I wanted to let the data do the talking on that. But again, you take a country that is disadvantaged in size, right? That is as a small population, and still manages to score so well across these many indicators that it winds up ranking higher than a large country. Again, a stability is not a function of how big you are, right? It is about the quality of your performance across all of these things. So when you take Switzerland, think about the strength of their currency, right? One of the strongest in the world historically. And that's one of our data points, is a 10-year last 10 years cumulatively of strength or stability of exchange rate versus the dollar. So Switzerland ranks very high. Of course, it ranks extremely high in the quality of its public institutions. It does obviously have a very strong military as well. So it shouldn't in the end surprise people that the country that, among other things, is also the most democratic country in the world is also the most stable. But the reason for Switzerland's stability is not its democracy alone. It ranks incredibly well in all of these.
Your last book, or maybe you've written so many, Parag, but the last book was about, I think, moving and you're very much you're Mr. Globalization. I think certainly you've lived in many countries and you're one of the great fans of migration. I wonder whether, though, if there was a MAGA reading of your periodic table, some people might say, well, maybe one of the reasons why the Swiss came out on top is because it's a very hard country to move to. They certainly don't have open borders. What was the connection in terms of your league table between countries that scored well and their immigration policies?
I'm very glad you raised this, because actually this is one of the things that didn't make it into the foreign policy essay, but is on the periodic table of states native site on our website at AlphaGeo.
And this is at AlphaGeo, your new research company.
Exactly. So you click on. I can send you the link. If you go to,
well, for our viewers and listeners who are interested in digging deeper into this, go to alphageo.ai.
And you'll find the periodic table of states. And there we actually have an entire section on migration, which I didn't get to touch on at all in the foreign policy essay. And there what we looked at is correlations of net inward migration to the stability ranking of a country. And a couple of really interesting things come out. First of all, on Switzerland, let's remember that it actually has a very high percentage of foreign-born population compared to other European countries, Western nations. And they've been absorbing, but very selectively, talent.
Yeah, I'm guessing. I mean, I don't want to turn this into another Trump conversation, but the fact that they let in. I was in Switzerland a few months ago. I was astonished. I was in Zug. I was astonished by the wealth. You go into a public car park and it's packed with Porsches and Bentleys and Rolls Royces and Ferraris. I mean, the wealth in this country is astonishing, and it's because they let in wealthy people. Is exactly what Trump's trying to do to the US.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that attracting wealthy people is a function of the commercial business model of the country, the tax rate, the fact that it's a hub headquarters for so many important global corporations, and it's an innovative economy, and people can get paid very well and not taxed that much, and so on and so on. But they are open to talent for sure, as Singapore is as well. And so you see that in Switzerland as well. So let's just make sure to disabuse anyone who has the impression that there is a Swiss ethnicity, right? Like there isn't, right? You're talking about a country that even if it had no migrants, would actually be so polyglot and diverse. How many countries have 5?
But there are, I mean, I'm not a Swiss expert, but there are Swiss ethnicities. I mean, wouldn't that be
plural, right? You have Germans, you have French.
German, French, Italian.
Linguistically, you have the Romansh. You have a country with, on the one hand, a certain cohesive national identity, but very distinct linguistic groups. That on top of all of that, because that's the European component, you now do have plenty of migrants from around the world in a kind of, again, a cohesive polyglot nation. So that aside, though, it's a great example of a country that has, again, numerically high net inward migration relative to its own population and as a percentage of its population, but also very high stability. But here's the part that's really worth talking about, Andrew. The countries that have the highest share of foreign-born population are the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, so the Gulf countries, but also, Singapore and others. So now here's your dilemma. The dilemma is this. Here you have countries that are not full democracies in the Western sense, but they rank very high in stability and very high in foreign-born population. So naturally, this begs the question, what is the best regime type to manage a high migration world? What happens to democracies when you have a flood of migrants in a very short period of time? Does that have a causal role in potentially destabilizing their politics? Now, the last 10 years of Western politics, migration has obviously played a very important and some would say, quote unquote, negative role. It has not played a negative role economically, to be clear. It's not played a negative role in terms of stimulating innovation. Far from it. You live in San Francisco, so you know all too well. But politically, it has not been managed well. Whereas the countries that have managed it exceedingly well are those that are not fully democratic because they have a top-down approach to that migration. They're very selective about who they let in, and everyone who comes in obeys the rules. So,
but it's more than that in the Gulf. I mean, you know the Gulf, again, much better than I do, Parag, but my understanding is that many of the workers in the Gulf, in the UAE, in Kuwait, Qatar, they go there to build football stadiums or work on the natural gas installations, but they're not given citizenship. So I don't know. Do you incorporate that, at least from a Western liberal point of view, troubling fact into your league table?
So you have to take that one country or system at a time. Like in Singapore, all the foreigners who live here are classified as part of the population and they have residency status. In the United Arab Emirates, guest workers or construction workers are not actual residents. They're not even defined as being part of the permanent resident population of the country. But even when you take the permanent resident population of the United Arab Emirates of 12 million people, more than any country on the face of the earth, 90+% of those, again, registered, formal, like you and me, circulating in day-to-day life, working in the economy, are not Emirati, right? And even those people are overwhelmingly South Asian, right? About 50-something%, I think, of the population. So I myself spent my entire childhood in Abu Dhabi until the age of 7. So I've seen the place evolve since its independence practically. And it is actually the fastest growing population of any country in the history of the world. So entirely on the back of immigration. But again, that's a different system. Do I have, I've worked with that government for more than 20 years, and I and many others have said, let's improve conditions for the guest workers. But for the purposes of what you and I are talking about, the migrant stock that are fully registered, residents of the country, they're obviously doing very well.
Yeah, the term guest worker might be a slight euphemism. Going down the league table, large countries, your family's originally from India, Brazil, and Russia fall into the second tier. 30 years ago on these kinds of tables, you could see India being grouped with Brazil and Russia. I have to admit, I was rather surprised to see in your periodic table of states, India being grouped with Brazil and Russia. I'm sure that the Indians aren't going to be particularly thrilled with this, are they?
Well, as you know, diplomatically, they group themselves together on their own with the things like the BRICS and whatnot. But that's a separate matter, one that we do tackle actually with our Venn diagram around.
Yeah, you've got that. You've got NATO and friends. You've got Shanghai Cooperation Universe, and then BRICS and friends. Yeah. You've done it all. So go on. But back to the Indians.
But so on the stability score, I don't think it should be surprising at all that we have found that some of the largest countries in the world that are so-called emerging markets or transition societies don't rank very high on the stateness metric. No one would look at, Russia or Brazil or India and say, you have one of the top tier, most effective states in delivering public services and the quality of your infrastructure and in these many other variables that we're looking at, right? So I don't know why anyone would be surprised at all. And then the general finding that most of the countries in the world are actually, small, weak democracies that are not particularly wealthy or well-governed. That's the most troubling finding. But the fact that such large countries, and then I add on top of that Nigeria, Pakistan and others, paints a really troubling picture that, even some of the biggest countries in the world by size or geography are not particularly strong states. Now,
you say that Nigeria is ranks 120th out of 196 countries.
Yeah. So again, you and I would know this, anecdotally, but there's and again, this is not an index of how big and muscular your state, pretends to be on the global stage. This is an index of the stability of the state in terms of its internal characteristics and virtues or lack thereof. That's what this is about, right? It's not about how many trade agreements and how many alliances India joins. And I'm glad that India is doing that. I'm glad Brazil is doing that. I'm all for the distribution, devolution of power in the global system. But you go to India, where, again, of course, I was born and spent a lot of time there as well, and tell me that you're looking at a top tier state. Of course you're not. So I don't see how that could surprise anyone.
Who comes, you got 196 countries. Who comes last in this?
Well, so there's no surprises. You'd be looking at what have typically been known as the LDCs, the least developed countries, the heavily indebted poor countries, HIPC, whatever acronym you want to use. Or you could even, dare I say, call it third world, though actually there's a fair number of countries that used to be third world that aren't quite at the bottom there. But the most vulnerable countries. And again, as I just said, sadly, when you really look at also the post-COVID, the effect of COVID and commodities price spikes, the sensitivity, the vulnerability that countries have to foreign aid and assistance that's being cut right now. I remind everyone in this piece that, again, most countries in the world really are small, poor, weak, and fragile. I conclude ultimately that you can't simply say, what are the most fragile 50 countries in the world? I conclude that most countries in the world really are rather fragile. And that's the bad news coming out of this. The good news is that we finally have a dashboard of quality indicators that actually matter for the effectiveness of a state, the quality of life for a society, that presents something of a roadmap for government leaders, business leaders, investors to look at, and for countries to benchmark themselves and say, look, I do want to do better. I actually sat with members of the cabinet of the UAE just very recently to go through this data. And rather than say, oh no, we ranked only 27th, we're very upset. That's not what they said. They said, we'd love to see where we can improve. Based upon these carefully curated criteria, tell us what you think we can do better in. And so we did. We went through the data sets and said, well, your supply chains could be more sustainable. You could do more for the participation of women in the workforce and a wide, range of other things. And they said, well, this is great. You are helping us become a better version of ourselves. And that, is, I think, the most important thing for someone like me who tries to see the world from the inside out, bottom up perspective of each nation, rather than trying to impose a value system from abroad. What motivates me to do this is that every country I've ever been in always just wants to be a better version of itself. They don't want to be like you or like the other country or the other country that thinks of itself as the best. They don't even want to be like Switzerland just because Switzerland is number one. They want to improve. They want to be a better version of themselves. And it's knowing that that is how societies think.
Except Denmark, of course, Parag. We all want to be Denmark, don't we?
So, getting to Denmark is the old joke, right? In political. Now, I guess you could at least say getting to Switzerland. Which, in many
I'd rather
ways,
be Denmark than Switzerland.
Again, you're more than welcome to your opinion and choice, and you can vote.
I'm going to get banned. I'm going to get banned from Switzerland. One of the things that I found really interesting, actually, in the report, or at least the piece in Foreign Policy, was your analysis, and you've always been an ambitious thinker, of this post-Westphalian world, where you have organizations, institutions, corporations that actually are more physically and networkly, if there's such a word, powerful than states. You talk about Google, for example. How do these trillion-dollar Silicon Valley behemoths, the Googles, the Apples of the world, fit into the periodic table of states?
It's a great question. And so that gets at the post-Westphalian part, as you just mentioned. And to me, as someone who the tradition in which I locate myself in political theory and international relations theory is called systems change, right? It's understanding how non-state actors actually have a role in the power dynamics. They're not just, sort of superficial add-ons. And so Google is a good example of that. A company whose infrastructural assets that span the world are not beholden only to one state. Yes, it's an American company. Yes, its headquarters is in America. Yes, its primary board composition is American. But at the extreme end of that spectrum of tech companies are those that are truly stateless, that could relocate their headquarters at a moment's notice if they wanted to. But Google has this geographically global infrastructural power that makes it, quite unique in its own right. And in many ways, geography, in the sense of political geography, would inhibit its power. And so that's why one of the claims I make in this essay is that if only some states were lucky enough to be stateless, they would actually have more influence. But whereas a stateless superpower like a Google can have global influence irrespective of any one state that it's nominally.
I wonder if it's coincidental, Parag, that Google, some of the Google CEO is Indian, as with Microsoft, and some of its most senior people are too. So the Indian diaspora, which I guess you're part of, or the high-tech, highly sophisticated Indian diaspora, is shaping this post-Westphalian world in a way perhaps more than India itself.
Yeah, I would love for people to see in the migration tab of the periodic table of states on our website, there's an infographic that I created that brings together three different things. I wanted to measure the size of the diaspora, where China's is still technically larger than India's, but the global distribution of the diaspora, where India would be more significant than China, more widely dispersed than China's, and then the value of remittances, both as a nominal figure, the dollar value, and also the contribution to GDP. And so when you take those three variables, the size, the distribution, and the value of remittances, India is overwhelmingly, the most significant diaspora in the world. And so we have a really interesting cartogram on that. And the question that you're asking, though, is the Indian diaspora more powerful than India itself, is actually a wonderful framing. It's not that you can inextricably, that you can divorce the two. Obviously, that would defeat the definition in a way of a diaspora inherently. But India as a state, the GDP of India is not very large. It's still 1/5 that of China, right? It isn't central in global trade. As I said in the connectography book, a state matters not just because it's big, it's how connected it is, right? What is its gravity in the global system, not just its size. And I think that that's really important. But whereas the weight of the Indian diaspora and the influence the diaspora has everywhere it is really, it punches above its weight. So I think you framed that question in a really interesting way, and you're suggesting the counterintuitive answer, which I'm not, I'm inclined to potentially agree with, that the diaspora matters, as much or more than the country, to the extent that you could.
I did better on that than on the Swiss question.
You have the golden ticket to India.
Oh, well, I'll take advantage of that. You and I have spoken at many conferences about Web3, Parag. Now that has been dislodged as the tech obsession with AI, but you touch on it in the piece, which I was interested in. You talk about decentralized autonomous organizations, and then, of course, crypto, Ethereum name service.
Right.
Is this froth, or is it real in this post-Westphalian world?
So, internet, Web3, blockchain, and then, cryptocurrencies on top, that particular stack, I feel, is very important, again, systemic evolution that we're undergoing, again, builds upon internet cables, data centers, and the ways in which those can't necessarily be controlled by any one state. And so by extension, what you can do now with blockchain, immutable ledgers, and have that privacy and so forth, I think is all here to stay. And I think that the economic and commercial and even political structures or institutions that can be built on top of that can be very powerful. So the examples I give obviously are things like Bitcoin or Ethereum. And so forth. So I do think those are actually quite crucial. And again, it's not that they are geography free. It's that smart geographies might leverage them to enhance their own power.
Right. You mentioned the Marshall Islands, although El Salvador, I think, was doing the same thing, which is, I'm guessing they didn't do very well on your league table. Are some states wise to embrace crypto, or is it, again, just mostly marketing?
Well, in the case of El Salvador, it's been as volatile as the Bitcoin price, and perhaps by design and not the best trade for them. Again, as we already know, prior to any commentary I've made on this, it tends to be countries with weaker financial systems and volatile countries that embrace crypto, in the sense that it's not the country, other than the case of El Salvador, it's the people who are using it to evade capital controls and get their money out of the country. It's not a vote of confidence in the country if the country, quote unquote is pro crypto by virtue of the fact that its citizens are using crypto to get the hell out of the country, much like their people are trying to get out of the country.
Yeah,
so
they're bringing in. They haven't had a great week in terms of media. In terms of this post-Westphalian world, you have essentially, I think, a Weberian analysis of power and violence. There is a darker side to this. I was particularly intrigued by a map which shows the power of mercenaries, militias, and organized criminals, especially this world of mercenaries. We've done there's been this rash of books now about the Wagner Group, and then there was a Guardian headline this week on the central role of Blackwater in Trump's efforts to throw migrants out of the United States. How real is the power of networks like non-state actors, violent non-state actors like the Wagner Group and Blackwater in this post-Westphalian world?
So what we wanted to get at here is that there is a territorial nature, obviously, to these so-called stateless non-state groups, right? So there is a headquarters, even if it's shifting. Take a Blackwater or other companies like that may have had origins or corporate registrations in South Africa, in America, in Hong Kong, in Dubai. They're shifty. What we wanted to map there with those network graphs is just their geography of operation. Like, for example, you take militant groups, heavily concentrated in West Asia, West Africa.
Yeah, for people just listening, it's a map featuring Muslim Brotherhood, Boko Haram, Hezbollah, Hamas.
Yeah. And if you go to the militias or organized crime, there you see truly globe-spanning networks. So organized crime is probably the most significant of these. It may not gather all the headlines, but you can see that of those categories that we've chosen, militias or religious entities or whatever, organized crime is by far the broadest. It has the most nodes that are linked to each other. And of course, that does mirror reality in which organized criminal groups link, Japan and Europe and America and Canada and so forth, all at the same time. So, but mapping those nodes does give you a much more concrete sense of the geographies of their influence. And that's what we wanted to capture there. But again, those nodes can shift any given year. When we were doing this research, we noticed that, of course, certain drug cartels used to be more prominent in, say, Colombia than they are today. And certain, Asian triad groupings have been stamped out, right? And so on and so forth. So they are a moving target. But of course, it's a perpetual cat and mouse game.
Well, the understanding here, Parag, is that the center of the world's illegal drug trade is in Canada. So I hope Canada finished low on your table.
Wait, where does it say that Canada is the center?
According to Donald Trump, anyway.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, I'm not going to...
the leading importer of fentanyl into the United States.
So again, to be clear, it's a global drug trade. Drugs out of South America do make it to Europe, right? And from Afghanistan too. We talk about, obviously, the opioid crisis in America when you and I are speaking, but you and I both know that ever since the Afghan wars of the 1980s, you've had rise of heroin trafficking into Europe, and you have a huge addiction.
Right, and I'm guessing if Afghanistan didn't exist, you'd have to invent it for this periodic table, because it sort of
you'd have to invent
every model and metaphor in your research.
You'd have to invent it to provide the origin stock of the drugs, yes, for that to satisfy the demand, which is precisely what the president of Mexico keeps reminding Americans about why there is this dilemma, right, when it comes to drugs. It's the demand side of the equation, not just the supply side of the equation.
You've been very generous with your time, Parag. Let's finish by returning to Central Europe, or East Central Europe, this post-Westphalian world. Treaty of Westphalia, of course, was a Central European event in the 17th century. And your league table is topped by two Central European countries, Switzerland and Germany. You talk, and I was particularly intrigued with this at the end in terms of the 21st century. And I'm quoting you, you say, "Don't be surprised by the resurrection of a neo-Hanseatic League of City-States." So the center of the world is returning to Central Europe, Parag?
I couldn't help myself because I think, as you know, Andrew, I went to high school near Hamburg, and the license plate of cars in the city of Hamburg is HH, which stands for Hansestadt Hamburg, for the Hanseatic League. So
and a wonderful city, a wonderful.
Oh, it so is. I get very nostalgic. So Hamburg and other cities, both that are today in northern Germany or across the Baltic states and so forth, form this quasi alliance of trade-oriented units, in the Middle Ages, in the early Middle Ages, high Middle Ages. And what I was arguing there, and we literally do have a modern version of a sort of cluster chart showing which countries are the most likely participants in this Neo-Hanseatic League by way of measuring A, being small in size, being strong in governance, and being high in innovation, because we collected a number of data sets around innovation. So ICT capacity, AI readiness, patents, and so on. And you'll see very clearly in that cluster graph on the upper left that it's Estonia, and it's Israel, and it's Singapore, and whatnot.
Small countries, yeah. I wonder whether. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. And these countries are already forming outside of the mainstream, global superstructure of formal alliances and bodies that we think of when we think of multilateralism. They're forming their own networks, more rapid visa-free access, scientific exchanges, academic partnerships, free mobility of labor, partnerships of their stock exchanges, M&A activities of their companies. That's happening all the time among exactly those countries that I'm calling the global Neo-Hanseatic League. So it's already alive and well and thriving. It just doesn't make day-to-day headlines because most people don't live in those countries. But by the way, living in one of those countries myself, these are wonderful islands of stability, to come back to that keyword, stability, in this sea of chaos.
Yeah, and I wonder, as hopefully in the next year or two, there'll be peace in Ukraine and a reorder of a post-Cold War age, just in our Post-Westphalian age, the Europeans becoming more active, whether that would actually speed up this Hanseatic, at least geographically in northern East Central Europe, this Neo-Hanseatic League, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, northern Poland. Even the Danes and the Finns might get involved. As always, Parag, Khanna, fascinating conversation. Congratulations on this table. You've convinced me it's a lot more valuable, your periodic table of states, than the 2025 World Happiness Report. So continue doing it. And when you come out with your 2026 version, we'll do it again. Hopefully, in the next few months, we'll have you back on. You're doing so much interesting work. Thank you so much.
I'd be honored. Thank you so much, Andrew. Great to see you.
Can I step on the scene?